It happened
In
at
terms
exactly
of what's the
11:47 a.m.
investigation, again,
17
going back to
minutes had
2008,
passed
Mr.
since she
Acosta,
began her
who limited the
questioning,
investigation
and in that
and limited the search
agonizingly
warrants and
precise
limited the
fraction of a
parameters of the
second, the
investigation.
crushing weight
The
of
only thing we are
reality
able to speak
finally
to
broke
publicly,
through
because
the
he was given
political
a
theater.
non-prosecution agreement by
That
Mr.
was the
Acosta,
exact
is
moment
that first
Ilhan
time
Omar
period from, I
understood
believe,
she
don't
had
quote me on this,
authored her
97 to
own
2001-ish.
destruction.
And
Sitting
then when the Trump
directly across from her
administration
was
courageously reopened
FBI
it.
Director Kash Patel. His hands rested gently on top of a stark red folder, fingers interlaced, projecting the kind of absolute, terrifying stillness that belongs only to a man holding an unbeatable hand and waiting patiently for the rest of the table to realize their chips are already gone. She was pitched forward, leaning over the heavy mahogany desk. A cell phone was pressed hard against her ear, while her lead counsel hovered over her shoulder, his voice reduced to a frantic, a breathless hiss. The sprawling expanse of the House Oversight Committee hearing room had descended into a vacuum of sound. This was not the quiet of polite parliamentary procedure. This was the suffocating atmospheric pressure drop that precedes a devastating storm, a collective paralyzed shock radiating from the gallery to the press pit. 47 million people were watching the feed live. The digital infrastructure of modern political consumption was literally buckling under the strain. The streaming servers at C-SPAN were failing, groaning under an unprecedented surge of traffic, and Twitter's architecture had already collapsed twice in the preceding 10 minutes. But inside the ornate wood-paneled walls of that room, none of the digital metrics mattered. What mattered was the singular, an undeniable truth written across Ilhan Omar's suddenly ashen face. Everyone in the chamber and tens of millions of people staring at screens across the globe could see the sudden, catastrophic shift in her eyes. This was a script that had gone terminally wrong. The narrative was supposed to be simple. She was the righteous prosecutor. She was the progressive champion who had hauled the director of the FBI in front of the blinding lights of national television to expose his alleged partisan witch hunts against left-leaning members of Congress. The stage had been set for a triumphant viral takedown. Instead, she found herself trapped in a corner she had aggressively painted herself into, entirely incapable of answering the very questions she had initiated. To comprehend the sheer scale of this disaster, to understand how a high-profile congressional career evaporated on live television, we have to spool the tape backward. We do not have to go far. Just 17 minutes earlier, the world looked entirely different. Chairman Mike Johnson had brought the heavy wooden gavel down 3 times. The sharp, percussive cracks echoed with authority through the high-ceilinged chamber, signaling the start of the proceedings. His voice was formal, carrying the practiced gravity of Capitol Hill. He announced that the House Oversight Committee was formally in session, convened to address the severe concerns raised by various members regarding the practices of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically focusing on explosive allegations that the Bureau was operating politically weaponized investigations aimed at sitting lawmakers. The chairman shifted his gaze downward to the witness table. Sitting there, entirely alone, was Kash Patel. There was no phalanx of public relations managers surrounding him. There were no anxious handlers whispering in his ear. There was only the director, a weathered leather portfolio, and a simple glass of water. Johnson offered a procedural note of gratitude, thanking the director for appearing voluntarily before the committee. Patel reached out and made a microscopic adjustment to the neck of his microphone. His response was an exercise in bureaucratic calm. He thanked the chairman and stated that he was completely willing to answer any inquiries the committee might have. The timbre of his voice was relentlessly steady, vibrating with the practice. So unbothered professionalism of a veteran operator who had navigated 1,000 of these high-stakes congressional interrogations and understood the architectural machinery of the room better than anyone else sitting in it. Across the dais, Ilhan Omar leaned into the dead space around her microphone. She looked every bit the icon she had been built up to be, wearing a sharply tailored black suit, complemented by a vibrant, deeply purple hijab. Her posture was impeccable. Her eyes were alight with an aggressive, glittering confidence. This was her grand stage. This was the culmination of weeks of relentless preparation, the moment she would cement her legacy as the fearless inquisitor who brought the deep state to heel. Her voice, when she finally spoke, sliced through the ambient murmur of the room like a freshly sharpened razor. She addressed the director directly, announcing her intention to bypass the customary political pleasantries. The American people, she declared with practiced rhetorical flourish, were entitled to unfiltered truth. She allowed a pregnant pause to hang in the air, a calculated beat designed to ensure the battery of television cameras had tightly framed her expression of righteous indignation. For the past 6 months, she continued, her voice echoing with controlled outrage, an alarming pattern had emerged. Multiple progressive lawmakers had come forward with terrifying accounts of being trailed, of having their private communications intercepted, and of enduring what could only be categorized as systematic harassment at the hands of federal law enforcement agents. She leaned closer to the microphone, her tone hardening. Too, she stated that the committee had been provided with numerous whistleblower disclosures, all of them credible, all of them pointing to a massive active surveillance apparatus maintained by the FBI, allegedly targeting no fewer than a dozen current members of Congress. A low electric hum swept through the gallery. The rows of credentialed journalists physically shifted in their seats, their fingers hovering over keyboards. This was the exact explosive soundbite the morning talk shows had predicted. Her volume ticked upward, filling the cavernous room. She emphasized that these were not randomly selected politicians. She rattled off the demographics of the alleged victims. They were progressives. They were Muslims. They were people of color. They were, in her narrative framing, to the courageous few who possessed the moral fortitude to speak truth to power, the lawmakers who dared to critique the foreign policy consensus of the United States, and the leaders who demanded strict accountability from opaque, monolithic institutions precisely like the one Kash Patel commanded. She locked her gaze onto the director, her eyes burning with a prosecuting intensity. She demanded a simple binary response. She asked him, point blank, requiring a yes or no answer, whether the FBI was currently engaged in active investigations of any sitting member of Congress. He did not blink. He did not look down at his notes. He did not seek the counsel of an attorney. Yes, Congresswoman, he replied. The chamber seemed to detonate. A chorus of audible gasps rippled through the audience. The mechanical, rapid-fire clicking of heavy camera shutters sounded like a sudden burst of automatic weapons fire. Deep in the back rows, where the junior staff and lesser-known representatives sat, a Republican congressman muttered an expletive of pure shock that was just loud enough for the highly sensitive ceiling microphones to pick up and broadcast to the nation. A faint, triumphant smile played at the corners of Ilhan Omar's mouth. She believed in that intoxicating second that she had won the war. She had drawn an on-the-record confession, broadcast on live network television, confirming that the premier law enforcement agency in the country was actively investigating elected officials. She immediately pressed her perceived advantage on demanding to know exactly how many of those covert operations were specifically zeroed in on progressive or Muslim representatives. His response remained maddeningly even. He acknowledged that certain individuals currently under federal scrutiny did indeed identify themselves politically as progressives, and that some identified their faith as Muslim. But before she could claim total victory, the director interjected, insisting that a crucial layer of clarification was required. She cut him off instantly. Her voice was sharp, a weapon meant to establish dominance. She reminded him that she had explicitly commanded yes or no answers. She launched into a fiery monologue, declaring that his admission was the absolute realization of their darkest fears. Oh, an undeniable confirmation of political persecution, masquerading as legitimate law enforcement. She accused him of willfully hunting down the brave officials who criticized the establishment. But Patel's voice, devoid of heat or aggression, sliced neatly through her rising crescendo. He did not yell. He did not posture. He simply applied the firm, unyielding pressure of a surgical blade. He reminded her that she had demanded a binary answer and that he had provided the affirmative she sought. However, he noted with chilling precision, in the realm of federal law, context is everything. He formally requested permission to provide that context. She dismissed the request with a careless wave of her hand, a gesture of supreme, fatal arrogance. She told him he could provide his context only after he had submitted to the remainder of her interrogation. She leaned forward again, her eyes narrowing, and asked if he had personally attached his signature to authorize surveillance operations against any member sitting on that very committee. Up in the gallery, 3 rows behind the witness table, the architecture of the disaster was already visible to the trained eye. Omar's personal attorney was shaking his head with frantic, white-knuckled desperation. His internal monologue was practically radiating across the room, pleading with his client to stop, to pull back, to avoid opening a door that could never be closed again. But she never looked back. She was entirely consumed by the euphoric high of her opening salvo. I absolutely convinced she had trapped the head of the FBI in an inescapable televised labyrinth. This was her fatal error. The mistake was not the question itself, but the blinding hubris that fueled it. She was so deeply entrenched in the role of the untouchable prosecutor that she failed to realize she had just proudly marched into the center of her own execution. Patel drew a slow, measured breath. The pacing of his response was lethal. He carefully explained the architecture of federal authority. He clarified that he did not sit in his office personally green-lighting individual wiretaps or surveillance logs. Instead, his role was to review and officially approve the investigatory recommendations that bubbled up from the regional field offices, but only when those recommendations strictly met the rigorous, inflexible standards of probable cause dictated by federal statute. He looked directly at her, his expression neutral. He delivered the killing blow to her premise with absolute bureaucratic detachment. He stated that if any member of that specific committee found themselves the subject of an active federal probe, it was not the result of a partisan vendetta. It was because veteran, career agents of the FBI, individuals who were not appointed by any political administration, had uncovered concrete evidence pointing toward the potential commission of serious federal crimes. Crimes of such magnitude that they legally demanded a formal inquiry. She scoffed. It was a physical, dismissive sound that was instantly captured by the audio equipment and beamed directly into the living rooms of 47 million Americans. She mocked his use of the phrase potential federal crimes, calling it a highly convenient linguistic shield. She challenged him, practically daring him to elaborate on the specific nature of the criminal acts he was allegedly accusing sitting lawmakers of committing. The ambient noise in the room vanished. The frantic typing of the press corps ceased abruptly. The silence became total, heavy, and expectant. Patel stared at her. The silence stretched out for a long, terrible moment. he finally spoke, his tone had shifted. It was no longer merely professional. It was measured, careful, and possessed an almost gentle quality that made the underlying threat infinitely more terrifying. "Congresswoman," he asked, his voice barely above a conversational murmur, "are you absolutely certain you want me to answer that specific question in an open session on live national television?" It was a blazing neon exit sign. It was the final off-ramp before the cliff. Behind her, her lawyer was physically out of his chair, his body language a desperate, silent scream for her attention, trying with everything he had to catch her eye and shut the proceeding down. But her pride was a fortress. She could not retreat. Not now. Not with the blinding lights of the cameras fixed on her face, and certainly not with the entire progressive political apparatus watching her every move. She had walked into that chamber with the express purpose of annihilating Kash Patel's public credibility. To back down in the face of his gentle warning would be to broadcast weakness. She doubled down. She invoked her title, he addressing him sharply, reminding him that she had asked a direct, straightforward question. She demanded to know, once again, the exact nature of the crimes the FBI was accusing members of Congress of committing. He held her gaze for another agonizing beat. Then, very slowly, he nodded. It was the nod of a man who had desperately tried to avoid a brutal necessity, but having been formally granted permission, was now prepared to execute his duty with absolute, devastating thoroughness. He clarified that he had not levied accusations against anyone. However, he noted, since she was explicitly demanding specific, granular details in the broadcasted, unclassified setting, he was willing to oblige. He raised his hand and gave a subtle, practiced signal to a grim-faced aide standing quietly against the far wall of the chamber. "You let us discuss the evidence," he said. The aide moved with military efficiency, stepping forward with a stack of heavy, sealed folders. They were bound in a glaring, institutional red. They carried the unmistakable weight of official federal authority. The aide began distributing them, dropping one in front of every single member of the committee. Stamped across the cover of each folder, in stark, unforgiving black ink, was a clearance code indicating that the contents had been explicitly approved for public session by the Office of Government Information Services. The room immediately fractured into a state of controlled, breathless chaos. Across the massive curved desk, elected officials began tearing away the seals. On the Republican side, jaws literally dropped as eyes widened, scanning the explosive contents of the very first page. On the Democratic side, members were speed reading with panicked intensity, desperately searching through the dense legal text for the trap they inherently knew had been set for them. When the red folder was placed in front of Ilhan Omar, her hands betrayed her. A fine, undeniable tremor shook her fingers as she broke the official seal. It was a microscopic loss of physical control, but the high-definition lenses of the C-SPAN cameras captured the vibration perfectly, broadcasting her sudden, visceral fear to the world. Patel did not rush. He waited with terrifying patience while the members of the committee absorbed the shock of the documents. His hands never left their folded position on the table. His face remained a mask of pure, neutral observation. He resembled a strict, yet unbothered academic waiting for a panicked classroom to finish reading a devastating surprise examination. When the frantic rustling of heavy paper finally began to subside, his voice cut through the tension. He informed the committee that what they were currently holding were heavily redacted, but highly detailed, summaries of 3 distinct, actively ongoing federal investigations. The probes, he explained, were centered on severe campaign finance violations, federal wire fraud, and potential breaches of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. All three investigations, he noted clearly, directly involved currently serving members of the United States House of Representatives. He added a procedural dagger, just to ensure the trap was fully sealed. But he informed them that every single word in those summaries had been meticulously reviewed and explicitly cleared for public release by the Department of Justice, the Office of Legal Counsel, and the Office of Government Ethics, specifically and exclusively for the purpose of this exact congressional hearing. Omar tore her eyes away from the terrifying text in front of her. Her eyes were wide, her carefully constructed composure fracturing in real time. She stammered, her voice losing its commanding edge, insisting that the entire procedure was highly irregular. She argued that the director of the FBI could not simply waltz into a congressional hearing and casually distribute the active files of ongoing criminal investigations. His response was no longer gentle. It was sharp, precise, and devoid of anger, possessing the core. The terrifying accuracy of a surgeon making a deep, irreversible incision. He reminded her, point by point, of her own actions. She was the one who had convened the hearing. She was the one who had spent the last 20 minutes aggressively demanding total transparency regarding the Bureau's investigations into elected officials. She was the one who had issued the summons, dragging him into the room to face her interrogation. He was simply providing, he stated with crushing logic, the exact, unvarnished transparency she had so loudly demanded. He let the sheer gravity of that statement settle over the room, watching her absorb the reality that her own political weapon had been turned completely against her. Then he offered her the trap door once more. He asked if she would prefer to halt the public spectacle immediately. He offered to reconvene the entire proceeding behind the heavily fortified, classified doors of a secure, compartmentalized information facility. All she had to do was say the word, and the cameras were cut to black. She was entirely paralyzed. The political mathematics of the moment were inescapable, and everyone watching understood the equation. If she slammed on the brakes and demanded a classified setting right then and there, the optics would be universally interpreted as a frantic attempt to hide catastrophic guilt. But if she allowed the hearing to continue, she was blindly walking into a minefield of federal evidence without a map. Her legendary pride, the very armor that had built her career, made the fatal decision for her. She gripped the microphone, her voice rising in a defensive, hollow octave. She declared that she possessed absolutely nothing to hide. The glittering, aggressive confidence that had defined her demeanor mere minutes ago had entirely evaporated, replaced by the cornered energy of prey. She demanded that the proceedings continue in the open, but desperately attempted to pivot, accusing the director of orchestrating a coordinated, partisan attack. She asked if she could pose another question. Patel blinked, his expression utterly flat. He reminded her, lightly but firmly, that the time belonged to her. It was her hearing. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. He seized the empty air. He suggested that, since she was struggling, he would happily provide a far more specific, a detailed answer to her original demand regarding the exact nature of the crimes the Bureau investigated when elected officials were involved. He reached forward and flipped open the cover of his own red folder. He announced that he would begin with the specifics of case file 2021 DC4478. He dropped his gaze to the heavily formatted page in front of him, letting the designation hang in the silent room before raising his eyes to meet hers again. He began to outline the architecture of the alleged crime. The file, he explained, centered on a staggering sum of money. Exactly $2.7 million in official campaign expenditures had been systematically funneled to a political consulting firm. The critical issue, he noted, That was that this firm was entirely owned and operated by a specific individual with whom the political candidate in question was allegedly engaged in a deeply personal, entirely undisclosed, and highly intimate relationship during the exact time frame those massive financial transfers were taking place. He detailed the origin of the probe. The Bureau had not acted on a whim. The investigation had been formally triggered by an extensive, heavily documented complaint filed by the National Legal and Policy Center back in March of 2020. The core allegation presented in that complaint was that regulated campaign war chests were being illegally drained to finance personal, lavish lifestyle expenses. This behavior, if proven, did not merely violate the civil statutes enforced by the Federal Election Commission. According to the director, but the mechanisms used to move the money potentially elevated the conduct to the level of federal wire fraud. The climate control system in the room was the only audible sound. The silence was absolute, a heavy physical thing pressing down on the shoulders of everyone present. All the blood had rushed out of Ilhan Omar's face, leaving her skin a stark, translucent gray. She leaned heavily against the desk, her voice barely a whisper, a terrifying realization dawning in her eyes. She asked him, her words trembling, if he was sitting there, on live television, openly discussing the internal finances of her own political campaign. He looked at her. His expression was impossible to read. It might have contained a microscopic trace of human sympathy for a person whose life was ending in front of him, or it might have been the freezing, by absolute calculation, of a grandmaster who had just moved his final piece across the board to announce checkmate. He reminded her of her own demands. She had aggressively demanded to know what specific crimes the Bureau looked for when dealing with Congress. He was merely providing a highly detailed, deeply specific example to satisfy her curiosity. He added, with a voice devoid of malice, that if the intricate financial details he was outlining happened to sound personally familiar to her, it was likely because every single piece of data he was citing had been painstakingly extracted from publicly available complaints, mandatory financial disclosure forms, and a mountain of banking documents secured through entirely lawful, judicially approved investigative subpoenas. At the far end of the Republican side of the dais, the Jim Jordan leaned aggressively into his microphone. The Ohio congressman recognized the kill shot and wanted it firmly established on the congressional record. He demanded a point of absolute clarification. He asked Director Patel to state, unequivocally, whether Congresswoman Omar was currently the target of an active FBI criminal investigation. Patel never broke eye contact with Omar. He addressed Jordan, reciting the ironclad policy of the Department of Justice. He stated that he was legally prohibited from either confirming or denying the specific identities of any unindicted subjects caught in the web of an ongoing federal probe without the explicit prior authorization of the Attorney General. However, he continued, the cadence of his voice slowing down to emphasize every single syllable. What he was legally permitted to state on the record was that the specific investigation designated as Case File 2021-DC-4478 was entirely focused on the conduct of a currently sitting member of the United States House of Representatives, and that this specific member represented the 5th Congressional District of the state of Minnesota. The trap snapped shut with deafening finality. Every single person breathing the air in that chamber, and every political operative watching in Washington, knew with absolute certainty that there was only one human being on the planet who held the title of representative for Minnesota's 5th District. And she was sitting right there, her hands gripping the thick wooden edge of the committee desk so tightly that her knuckles had turned a bruised, bloodless white. Her panic finally broke through, for her voice spiked into a shrill, defensive octave, echoing wildly off the high ceilings. She accused the director of engineering a monstrous outrage. She screamed that he was intentionally weaponizing the authority of a congressional hearing to orchestrate a vicious, highly public, and entirely baseless smear campaign against her. Patel's demeanor did not shift a millimeter. His voice remained a calm, measured baseline, a stark contrast to her unraveling sanity, which somehow made his words feel infinitely more devastating. He calmly pointed out that he was doing nothing more than answering the exact questions she had forcefully demanded he answer. She had ordered him to provide the specifics of the FBI's work. He was simply delivering the inventory. He offered her a final, hollow courtesy, and he asked her if she would like him to stop speaking. The agonizing silence returned. It was a physical torture. She whipped her head around to look at her attorney. The man was defeated. He was frantically shaking his head, mouthing the word "stop" over and over again, his eyes wide with professional terror. But the political reality of her existence weighed too heavily on her. Half of the progressive activist base in the country was watching the feed. The anchors at CNN were analyzing her every twitch. The producers at MSNBC were waiting for her to fight back. She was trapped in a prison of her own public image. She could not surrender the floor now without looking unequivocally, devastatingly guilty. She dragged a ragged breath into her lungs, desperately attempting to piece her shattered composure back together. She forced a defiant tone into her voice, agreeing to debate the specifics. She argued that the very concept of campaign spending was fundamentally legal. She insisted that hiring political consultants was a standard, universally accepted practice in Washington. She demanded to know, with a sudden burst of defensive anger, what the actual underlying criminal allegation was supposed to be. That was the moment Kash Patel opened the stark red folder all the way, laying the documents flat against the table. The allegation, he stated, his voice ringing with terrifying clarity, was that massive sums of donor funds intended for political campaigning had been systematically diverted for immense personal financial benefit. He laid out the math. The Bureau was looking at a staggering $2.7 million in payments authorized by her campaign and wired directly to the E Street Group, a consulting entity wholly owned by a man named Tim Miner. The federal allegation was that this fortune was not exchanged for legitimate, verifiable campaign services, but rather served as a financial conduit. She interrupted him, her composure cracking wide open, her voice practically shouting into the microphone. She insisted wildly that every single dime spent was a legitimate, legally defensible campaign expense. She accused the Bureau of launching a puritanical witch hunt designed to criminalize her private life, declaring loudly that her personal relationships were absolutely none of the FBI's business. He did not talk over her. He let her scream. He allowed the raw, desperate energy of her outburst to wash over the silent room, letting the cameras capture every bead of sweat and every frantic gesture. When she finally ran out of breath, he spoke. His voice was incredibly quiet now, carrying a deadly, sympathetic weight. He agreed with her completely. He stated that her personal life was, in fact, entirely her own private business. However, he noted with devastating legal precision the exact moment millions of dollars in federally regulated campaign funds enter the equation. Her private life legally transforms into the direct business of the Federal Election Commission. And, he continued, when the sheer volume of the money and the labyrinthine patterns of the wire transfers begin to indicate the potential presence of systematic financial fraud, her private life officially becomes the business of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He reached into the folder and slowly extracted a single, heavily printed sheet of paper. It was a chronological timeline. He politely requested permission to walk the committee through the evidentiary chain. Kash predator who had spent 2 decades hunting in the dark waters of federal investigations. He understood the psychology of evidence presentation. He knew that dumping a mountain of raw data onto a committee only created confusion. Instead, he understood the brutal art of building a case. He laid the bricks one by one, methodically constructing a wall of evidence around his target until it was far too high to ever climb over. He began at the foundation, his voice adopting the methodical, our inescapable cadence of a master professor delivering a final, undeniable lecture to a captive audience. He started with the E Street Group. He noted that the firm, under the sole ownership of Tim Minor, first began receiving wire transfers from Omar's campaign accounts back in April of 2018. The initial retainer was set at $15,000 a month. Patel, projecting an air of absolute fairness, conceded that this initial figure was actually quite standard for high-level digital consulting work in the political sphere. He pressed a button, and the stark, clean lines of his timeline illuminated the massive presentation screens mounted throughout the hearing room. It was a devastatingly simple visual. April 2018. The payments to E Street begin. $15,000 a month. Then, he moved to the summer, June 2018. And he detailed how multiple, independent witnesses had begun providing statements to federal agents, reporting that they had observed the Congresswoman and Mr. Minot together at various social functions. These were not fundraisers or political rallies. These were intimate dinners at high-end restaurants and quiet, private gatherings. August 2018. The timeline advanced. The monthly payments wired to E Street Group suddenly exploded, skyrocketing to $64,000 a month. Omar was staring up at the massive monitors as if the glowing pixels were about to reach out and set her violently on fire. November 2018. The numbers jumped again. The monthly payout to the consulting firm hit $180,000. Patel paused, offering a microscopic concession, noting that November was an election month, and therefore high expenditures could theoretically be justified. He suggested they put a pin in that specific number and move forward. March 2019. The timeline took a brutal, personal turn. Dr. Beth Jordan Minette officially filed legal paperwork seeking a divorce from her husband, Tim Minette. Patel read from the federal summary, noting that in her sworn legal filings, she explicitly and specifically cited her husband's ongoing romantic affair with a named high-profile individual as the catalyst for the destruction of their marriage. He let the silence return, allowing the sheer weight of the sworn legal document to hang suspended in the sterile air of the committee room. She named you Congresswoman, Patel said softly. Omar's voice fractured. It was a broken, reedy sound. She stammered that the divorce was an entirely private matter, desperately trying to build a firewall between the legal filing and the campaign accounts. She insisted the divorce had absolutely nothing to do with the finances. Patel didn't even blink. His voice drove right through her desperate objection as if she hadn't spoken at all. April 2019. He advanced the timeline to the kill shot. Exactly 1 month after the explosive divorce filings became public knowledge. Exactly 1 month after the allegations of the affair had been plastered across the front pages of the national media. In that specific month, Patel announced, his eyes locked onto hers, the campaign authorized a massive wire transfer. They paid the E Street Group $275,000. And he looked away from the monitors and stared directly into her soul. He repeated the figure, letting the gravity of the math crush the room. $250,000, transferred in a single 30-day period, wired directly into the corporate accounts of a company entirely owned and controlled The chamber was entirely paralyzed. The political reporters in the gallery had stopped breathing. This was no longer a dry academic debate over the arcane nuances of campaign finance statutes. This was a primal, devastating story of hubris, money, and ruin. And Washington, above all else, is a city that feeds on ruined lives. Patel leaned back slightly, adjusting his tone. He adopted a conversational, almost folksy demeanor that made the impending data drop feel like a physical assault. He confessed that he was not, by trade, an expert in the minutiae of campaign finance law. But, he added, he was a man who knew how to do research. He explained that he had instructed his agents to pull the financial filings of comparable political campaigns. He looked for politicians operating in districts with similar geographic sizes, dealing with similar demographic makeups, and facing similar electoral challenges. He cited the campaign of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. He noted that AOC's team, operating a massive, highly visible national operation, had paid their primary digital consulting firm a total of $47,000 for the entirety of the 2018 election cycle. He paused, letting that baseline number settle into the record. Then, he delivered the comparative hammer blow. During that exact same election cycle, Omar's campaign had transferred a staggering $890,000 to the E Street Group. He let the horrifying disparity of those two numbers echo off the wood paneling. He calculated the ratio for the committee. Her campaign had paid 19 times the industry standard rate. She had authorized these massive payouts for services rendered in a congressional district that possessed roughly half the total population of the comparative models. So, Patel concluded, his voice dripping with terrifying, polite curiosity, the natural question arose. He had personally asked his team of elite forensic accountants a very simple question. Exactly what kind of unprecedented, world-class services did the E Street Group provide to legally justify earning 19 times the established industry baseline? Omar opened her mouth to speak, but her vocal cords refused to engage. She closed it. She turned her head in a blind panic to look at her lawyer. The attorney was hunched over the desk, his pen flying frantically across a yellow legal pad. But the absolute despair radiating from his posture telegraphed to the entire world that he had absolutely no legal defense to offer. Patel answered his own question. The Bureau, he revealed, could find virtually no concrete documentation of any actual services rendered to justify the mountain of cash. He noted that her mandatory filings with the Federal Election Commission were incredibly opaque. They categorized the massive wire transfers using incredibly vague or generalized terminology like digital consulting and travel expenses. There were no invoices, no deliverables, nothing to justify the burn rate. So, Patel said, his voice dropping into the terrifying register of an apex predator closing its jaws. The Bureau dug deeper. He produced another sheet of paper from the red folder. This document was thick with columns of numbers, many of them heavily highlighted in blinding yellow ink. He returned to the catastrophic month of April 2019. He focused on that singular, massive payment of $275,000. The Bureau's forensic accountants, wielding federal subpoenas, had not just looked at the money going into the E Street Group. They had meticulously traced exactly where the money went after it landed in Tim Minett's corporate accounts. And he broke down the disbursement. First, the E Street Group authorized a payment of $18,000. This money was wired to Sterling Crisis Communications. Patel offered a brief, professional nod of recognition. Sterling, he noted, was a very real, highly respected, cutthroat crisis management firm operating deep inside the Washington Beltway. They were an outfit composed of highly paid professionals whose sole job was to make catastrophic public scandals disappear. Hiring them, given the media firestorm surrounding the divorce, made perfect, logical sense. He looked up from the highlighted page, his eyes locking onto Omar's terrified face. But, he noted with surgical precision, $18,000 was merely a fraction of the total haul. If you subtract the crisis management fee from the initial wire transfer, you are left with $257,000. He asked her, point blank, where the rest of the campaign's money had disappeared to. The silence in the hearing room was no longer just heavy. It was a physical weight, crushing the oxygen out of the air. The red tally lights on the front of the massive broadcast cameras seemed to burn with the intensity of small suns. Every lens tightly framed on the horrific public disintegration of Ilhan Omar's political existence. She looked small, terrified, and desperate to sink into the floorboards and vanish. "Let me help you," Patel offered. His voice was laced with a horrific, devastating kindness. The feigned sympathy was the most brutal weapon he had deployed yet. He began to read the results of the forensic wire trace. First, at exactly $100,000 of the campaign's money was cleanly sliced off and wired directly into an obscure, newly minted limited liability company. This LLC was not associated with the E Street Group. It was registered exclusively in the personal name of Tim Minette. It was a direct, six-figure cash transfer into his private control. Next, a wire transfer in the amount of $75,000 was executed. This money was sent directly to a boutique, ultra-exclusive luxury travel agency. Patel did not just provide the number, he provided the receipts. He noted that the specific dates the travel agency booked a sprawling, 3-week, 5-star vacation to the Maldives perfectly aligned with a series of photographs uploaded to Tim Minette's private locked Instagram account. Patel paused, in letting the image of a federally funded tropical vacation burn itself into the minds of the voting public. Finally, he delivered the last line item. $50,000 had been wired to a high-end residential real estate escrow company. The money was legally coded as a cash down payment. The property in question was a historic, multi-million-dollar townhouse located in the wealthiest enclave of Georgetown. And, Patel concluded, referencing the official municipal property records of the District of Columbia, that specific townhouse was currently legally owned in a joint capacity by Tim Minette and Ilhan Omar. If a pin had dropped onto the carpeted floor of the chamber, it would have sounded like a gunshot. Patel leaned forward, pressing the advantage until the bones snapped. He politely asked her for the official record and to explain how any of those specific disbursements, the $100,000 personal payout, the $75,000 tropical vacation, or the $50,000 down payment on a luxury home they shared, could possibly be categorized under any interpretation of federal law as legitimate political campaign activities. Her lawyer violently shoved his chair backward and sprang to his feet. His voice echoed through the paralyzed room, demanding that the chairman halt the proceedings immediately so he could privately confer with his client. Chairman Johnson did not hesitate. He gripped his gavel and ordered the attorney to sit down. He reminded the lawyer, his voice dripping with righteous authority, that it was his client who had aggressively demanded this hearing, and that Director Patel was doing nothing more than answering the exact questions she had forced him to answer. The lawyer collapsed back into his leather chair. Omar turned to him, her eyes wide with a desperate, silent plea for salvation. He slowly, painfully shook his head. There was no legal maneuver, no rhetorical trick, and no parliamentary procedure that could save her from the man. When she finally spoke, her voice was entirely shattered. It was a broken, barely audible whisper that forced the audio engineers to frantically boost the gain on her microphone. She stammered that she would need the opportunity to comprehensively review those specific, granular financial transactions with her legal and accounting teams before she could possibly offer a substantive response. Patel nodded. Oh, he acknowledged her right to seek counsel, but he refused to let her escape the trap without publicly bleeding. He summarized her position for the national audience, stating with terrifying clarity that as she sat there in that moment, she was entirely incapable of explaining to the American people how over $250,000 of her donors' money explicitly given to fund her political re-election, had vanished into a labyrinth of personal payouts, luxury vacations, and high-end real estate in a single month. He allowed another agonizing pause to stretch across the room. When Omar finally forced herself to reply, her words were so hollow and quiet, they barely registered on the audio feed. She repeated that she could not answer without reviewing the full documentation. Patel nodded again, a slow, patronizing nod of a disappointed headmaster, forcing a lying student to admit they had fabricated their homework. He thanked her for her entirely inadequate answer. Then he reached back into the red folder. He warned her that the terrifying financial anomalies they had just discussed were merely the beginning. The devastating pattern of alleged fraud, he noted, did not stop at the borders of her campaign accounts. The camera captured the exact micro-expression of absolute terror that washed over Omar's face. The realization crashed into her that this was not a localized scandal. Kash Patel was not just auditing her campaign, he was systematically disassembling her entire life. And he had brought the receipts for every single piece of it. Let us shift our focus to your federal tax returns, Patel announced, his hand emerging from the seemingly bottomless depths of the red folder, clutching a new stack of heavily watermarked documents. On the Democratic side of the dais, Jerry Nadler hurled his body forward, his voice booming into the microphone in a desperate attempt to throw sand in the gears of the machine. The veteran congressman launched a furious objection, screaming at the chairman that the FBI director was brazenly violating committee rules by broadcasting deeply personal, highly confidential federal tax information in an unclassified setting. Patel's voice cut through the shouting, utterly devoid of emotion. He stated, with the absolute authority of the federal code, that tax information ceases to be a private, personal matter the exact moment it becomes the central evidentiary foundation of a potential federal crime. He asserted Congresswoman Omar's joint federal filings from the years 2014 and 2015 were not just relevant, but absolutely critical to the core of the ongoing criminal investigation. He turned his dead, unblinking eyes back to Omar. He began to dissect her life. He noted that in the tax year of 2014, she had filed her federal returns jointly with a man named Ahmed Hirsi. She had explicitly claimed the legal status of married filing jointly. On those sworn federal documents, she had listed a primary residential address located in the city of Minneapolis, and she had claimed 3 dependent children. Patel nodded, conceding that on its face, the filing appeared to be standard, unremarkable paperwork. He let the silence build again. It was a weapon he wielded with absolute mastery. But, he continued, and the narrative collapsed when cross-referenced with the official, legally binding marriage records maintained by the state of Minnesota. According to the state's Vital Statistics Registry, during the exact same period she was filing federal taxes as the legal wife of Ahmed Hirsi, she was actually legally married to an entirely different man, an individual named Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi. Patel read the dates with crushing precision. Her legal marriage to Mr. Elmi had been formally registered with the state authorities in 2009. the state records proved that this legal union was not formally dissolved by a judge until the year 2017. The last remnants of color drained from Omar's face, leaving her looking completely ashen. She was visibly trembling now. Patel demanded that she help him understand the chronological impossibility of her life. He asked her, his voice echoing with the threat of federal perjury charges, exactly how she managed to legally file a joint federal tax return under the penalty of perjury with Ahmed Hirsi, while she was simultaneously legally bound in marriage to Ahmed Elmi. She stammered wildly, her defense fracturing into incoherent pieces. She tried to fall back on the narrative that had shielded her from local reporters for years. She insisted that her relationship with Hirsi was a deeply held cultural marriage, a spiritual union recognized by her community, and she denied that the arrangement was illegal. Patel didn't argue with her. He simply raised a single piece of paper into the air. He announced that he was physically holding the official to state-certified copy of Minnesota State Marriage Certificate number MC 20090178854. He read the damning details into the congressional record. The document listed Ilhan Abdullahi Omar as the bride. It listed Ahmed Noor Saeed Elmi as the groom. The date of the legal union was recorded as February 12, 2009. The document bore the signature of the officiating authority, the signatures of the legally required witnesses, and the raised embossed seal of the state of Minnesota. He lowered the paper and placed it gently, almost reverently, onto the polished wood of the witness table. He presented her with a paralyzing binary legal track. He stated that if the state-certified marriage document sitting in front of him was a legitimate, legally binding record, with then the federal tax returns she filed jointly with a completely different man constituted the deliberate filing of fraudulent documents with the IRS. That, he noted coldly, was a severe federal crime. However, he continued, tightening the noose, if she was claiming that the state marriage certificate was a fraudulent document, fabricated for some other purpose, then she was facing a vastly different, but equally terrifying set of federal problems. He asked her which of the two federal crimes she would prefer to confess to. She turned to her lawyer in a state of total, paralyzed panic. But the attorney had completely abandoned the fight. He had stopped taking notes. He was slumped back in his leather chair, staring blankly at the ceiling, radiating the profound, crushing desire to be literally anywhere else on the planet. She tried to speak, her voice trembling so violently it sounded like she was crying. She repeated the phrase she had used for years, insisting that the situation was incredibly complicated and that her community engaged in cultural practices that the rigid bureaucracy of the IRS simply failed to recognize. Patel destroyed the defense with a single sentence. He informed her, his voice still maddeningly, terrifyingly calm, that the United States Federal Criminal Code does not recognize the concepts of complicated or cultural practices as valid legal defenses against perjury. Under federal law, he explained, a citizen is either legally married or they are not. There is no gray area. And if a citizen deliberately signs a federal tax document claiming a legal marriage to one individual, while simultaneously maintaining a legally binding marriage to another, that act is defined as perjury. It is the act of making materially false statements to the federal government, a felony that carries a mandatory sentence of up to 5 years in a federal penitentiary. He leaned back in his chair, anticipating her next desperate pivot. He told her to save her breath if she was planning to use her standard political talking point, claiming the marriage allegations had been thoroughly debunked. He stated, with the absolute confidence of a man holding all the cards, that the FBI did not deal in right-wing conspiracy theories. They dealt in concrete, admissible evidence. he rattled off the inventory of the Bureau's findings. They possessed the certified marriage certificates. They possessed the fraudulent tax returns. And they had subpoenaed the historical utility bills, which definitively proved that Mr. Elmi was physically residing at the exact address she had listed as her primary residence on the fraudulent federal filings. And, most devastatingly, they possessed sworn statements from witnesses. He repeated, staring a hole through her, that this was not a political hit job. This was a mountain of federal documents. The Republican side of the dais smelled blood in the water. James Comer lunged toward his microphone, practically shouting to be heard over the rising murmur of the gallery. He demanded to know if the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS was actively pursuing the tax fraud angle. Patel confirmed the congressman's suspicion instantly. The IRS had formally opened their criminal case back in 2021. However, Patel added, "See, dropping the next bomb, the FBI was heavily assisting the IRS in the probe because the fraudulent tax filings were deeply intertwined with far more serious concerns regarding systemic immigration fraud." Comer pressed the attack, demanding details on the immigration angle. For the very first time in the hearing, Patel hesitated. It was a fleeting, microscopic pause, a brief recalibration of the legal boundaries. He cautioned that he likely shouldn't delve deeply into the granular details of the immigration probe without secondary, explicit clearance from the upper echelons of the DOJ. But then he looked back at Ilhan Omar. She was broken. She was staring blindly at the surface of her desk, completely incapable of meeting his eyes. He decided to turn the knife, and he announced that since the Congresswoman had aggressively demanded this hearing and forced the door open, he would walk the committee through the threshold. He revealed the core of the immigration investigation. The Bureau had obtained the official records showing that Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi had formally petitioned the United States government for permanent residency status in the year 2011. On that sworn federal application, Mr. Elmi explicitly listed Ilhan Omar as his legal spouse. Furthermore, the exact same Minnesota marriage certificate Patel had just read into the congressional record was submitted to federal immigration authorities as the primary supporting documentation to justify the residency request. Based on the strength of that marriage, the United States government had approved his application. He let the sheer weight of the federal immigration apparatus settle over the room. The primary concern of the active investigation, Patel explained with surgical care, was the true intent behind the union. He stated clearly that if the evidence proved she had legally married Mr. Elmi for the sole, explicit purpose of fraudulently securing his United States immigration status, while she simultaneously maintained an ongoing, domestic, and romantic relationship with Ahmed Hirsi, a man with whom she was actively raising children, that specific sequence of actions met the exact legal definition of federal immigration fraud. Omar's voice was completely devoid of its former power. It was a desperate, pleading sound. She practically begged the committee to remember that local media outlets in Minnesota had spent years investigating the marriage rumors and had universally concluded that they had found absolutely nothing improper. Patel agreed with her immediately. He acknowledged that the local media had indeed engaged in reporting. But, he noted, drawing a terrifying distinction between journalism and the federal government, the FBI does not write articles. The FBI conducts criminal investigations. He laid out the sheer terrifying power of the federal machine. The media, he pointed out, does not possess subpoena power. Reporters cannot deploy teams of forensic accountants to tear apart decades of financial history. They cannot secure federal warrants to geolocate cellular phone records or demand the historical residential data of private citizens. He reached into the folder one more time. He produced a new document, a summary of field interviews. He revealed that federal agents had tracked down and formally interviewed 12 separate witnesses who were deeply embedded in Omar's life during the critical period between 2009 and 2017. The results were catastrophic. 11 of the 12 witnesses swore under penalty of federal perjury that she had never at any point actually cohabitated with Ahmed Elmi as a functioning spouse. 8 of those same witnesses provided sworn testimony, confirming she had maintained an uninterrupted, romantic relationship with Ahmed Hirsi for the entire duration of her legal marriage to Elmi. And, Patel concluded, while delivering the final crushing blow to her defense, 3 of those witnesses explicitly testified that she had openly and brazenly confessed to them that the entire marriage to Elmi was a sham constructed solely to help him secure his American immigration papers. Omar was entirely frozen. She looked like a statue carved out of panic. Her attorney had surrendered completely. His elbows were resting on the heavy wood of the desk, and his face was buried deep in his hands. Patel reminded her, his voice utterly devoid of malice, that he was not sitting in that chair to hurl baseless accusations. He was simply executing her command. She had demanded to know what crimes the Bureau investigated. His answer was devastatingly simple. The FBI investigates the exact same crimes regardless of the target. Tax fraud is tax fraud. Immigration fraud is immigration fraud. Campaign finance fraud is campaign finance fraud. The Bureau, he stated with chilling finality, did not care if the subject of the probe was an untouchable progressive congresswoman or a clerk working the night shift at a convenience store. The brutal machinery of federal law applies with absolute terrifying equality. But Kash Patel was not finished. The most devastating revelation was still waiting in the dark. He announced that there was one final, critical area of the active investigation that he was legally compelled to address. He reached into his leather portfolio and extracted a noticeably thinner folder. This one was different. It was clearly marked with a much higher, far more restrictive classification tier. He informed the silent, terrified room that the contents of this specific file had required an emergency, secondary level of authorization from the highest levels of the Department of Justice. Clearance he had only secured that very morning. He opened the thin folder with slow, deliberate care. He transported the room back to October of 2017. He detailed a specific, highly choreographed trip Omar had taken to the city of Istanbul, Turkey. During her time there, the Bureau had documented a series of high-level, closed-door meetings she had conducted with prominent officials operating on behalf of the Qatari government, specifically noting deep engagements with high-ranking representatives from the Qatari embassy and operatives within the incredibly powerful Qatar Foundation. Omar's eyes practically bulged out of her skull. She found a momentary burst of defensive energy, shouting into the microphone that her calendar was packed with international meetings. She insisted, her voice shrill with panic, that sitting down with foreign dignitaries was a fundamental, universally accepted requirement of her position as a senior member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Patel agreed without hesitation. He validated her premise entirely. He stated that it was absolutely normal, appropriate, and expected for senior lawmakers to engage with foreign leadership. He paused, letting the validation hang in the air just long enough for it to curdle into dread. But, he continued, what triggered the interest of the federal intelligence apparatus was not the meetings themselves, but the incredibly specific, the highly suspicious behavioral patterns that emerged immediately afterward. He laid out the timeline. Within 6 months of returning from those closed-door sessions in Istanbul, she had launched a massive, highly public, and utterly relentless campaign of criticism aimed directly at the geopolitical rivals of Qatar, specifically launching launching vitriolic attacks against the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Patel noted that, as a politician, she possessed the absolute right to criticize any regime she chose. However, he pointed out, the Bureau found it incredibly notable, from an intelligence perspective, that she remained utterly, completely silent regarding the well-documented, horrific human rights abuses committed by the Qatari government, and a regime that suffered from the exact same structural atrocities she loudly condemned in its neighbors. She fired back, her voice desperate, claiming she possessed the absolute right to speak out on the specific geopolitical issues she deemed appropriate. Patel did not argue the point. He simply moved to the moon. He revealed that in the years immediately following the Istanbul meetings, specifically 2018, 2019, and 2020, the financial accounts tied to her political campaigns had suddenly experienced an influx of exactly $187,000. This money, Patel stated, pulling a heavily redacted list from the thin folder, was systematically donated by a network of specific individuals and corporate entities that all possessed deep, highly documented, and incredibly lucrative business ties directly to the sovereign interests of the state of Qatar. He tapped the list, telling her she didn't have to take his word for it. The names were fully indexed on page 22 of the red folder sitting in front of her. He described the donor network: individuals holding massive contracts with Qatar Airways, executives embedded in the subsidiaries of the Qatar Foundation, and financial operators moving money for entities deeply tied to the Qatari Sovereign Wealth Fund. Omar was tearing through the heavy pages of the red folder now, her hands moving with the frantic, uncoordinated speed of a person desperately trying to defuse a bomb with seconds left on the timer. She stammered that receiving political donations was a legal activity. She yelled that taking meetings was legal. She insisted that holding favorable policy positions regarding specific nations was the literal definition of politics. Patel let her finish her frantic defense. Then, he introduced the room to a completely different, terrifying piece of the federal code. He explained the architecture of the Foreign Agents Registration Act, commonly known in Washington as FARA. It is a rigid, unforgiving statute that legally mandates any individual operating within the United States who acts in any capacity as an agent, advocate, or proxy for a foreign government must formally register their activities with the Department of Justice. He stared directly into her eyes, the silence in the room becoming absolute. He asked her the question that would end her career. He asked if she had ever formally registered as a foreign agent. She reacted with pure, visceral horror. She shouted into the microphone, her voice echoing wildly, declaring that she was not a foreign operative, but a duly elected congresswoman of the United States. Patel's response was a masterclass in bureaucratic devastation. He informed her, his voice barely above a whisper, that under the strict definitions of federal law, the two titles were not mutually exclusive. He explained the exact legal threshold. He stated that if the evidence proved she had deliberately weaponized her congressional power to advocate for specific, highly favorable foreign policy positions that benefited the state of Qatar, and if she had executed those actions in direct exchange for targeted financial support, whether that money flowed directly into her campaign war chest or was funneled into affiliated political organizations, that specific transactional relationship legally triggered the absolute requirement to register under FARA. She desperately tried to thread a needle that didn't exist. She screamed that she had never received a single dime in personal payouts from the Qatari government. Patel corrected her instantly. He reminded her that he had never alleged she took personal bribes. He had specifically cited campaign donations and the funding of affiliated political organizations. Under the sprawling reach of FARA, he noted, the law aggressively covers both avenues of financial support. Then, the director reached into his suit jacket. He pulled out his personal cellular phone and placed it gently on the table in front of him. He announced that the FBI, utilizing a lawfully executed, heavily scrutinized warrant explicitly approved by a sitting federal judge, had successfully breached and extracted the encrypted data from a specific communications device. The Bureau had secured the complete archive of WhatsApp messages transmitted between the Congresswoman and a highly placed, deeply connected foreign intermediary. Patel noted that while the true identity of the intermediary was blacked out in the unclassified folders, he was legally permitted to reveal that the individual was a Qatari national possessing undeniable direct ties to the highest levels of the Qatari government. Ilhan Omar completely stopped breathing. Her chest remained frozen. Patel explained that because he lacked the final tier of DOJ authorization required to read the intercepted communications verbatim into the public record, he would instead provide the committee with the officially cleared, unclassified summary of the encrypted conversations. He read the summary. He stated that the intercepted messages explicitly discussed, and he quoted the federal document directly, compensation for advocacy on Gulf policy issues, and detailed coordinated efforts to ensure a favorable congressional stance on Qatar sanctions vote. He looked up from the page. He asked her, with a voice that sounded like a heavy steel door slamming shut, if she would care to explain to the committee and to the millions of people watching at home and exactly what the phrase compensation for advocacy meant in the context of a sitting member of the United States Congress communicating secretly with a foreign government. The hearing room had achieved a state of absolute total paralysis. The silence was so profound, it felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the chamber. Every single human eye and the unblinking lenses of every single broadcast camera was locked onto the frozen, terrified face of Ilhan Omar. The high-definition feeds were so incredibly tight that the nation could clearly see the sheer terror radiating from her eyes and the heavy beads of cold sweat forming rapidly across her forehead. She ripped her gaze away from Patel and turned violently toward her attorney. She began whispering with frantic, wild intensity. He leaned in, his face pale, whispering back with equal desperation. She shook her head violently, rejecting whatever legal reality he was trying to force upon her. He reached out, physically grabbing her arm to stop her from moving, his voice dropping into an urgent, terrifying hiss. Finally, after an eternity of panicked whispering, she turned her face back to the dead microphone. She sounded like a completely different human being. The fire, the arrogance, the aggressive posture of the untouchable progressive icon, it was all gone, burned away by the sheer proximity of federal ruin. She whispered that she would need to physically review the raw, unredacted text of the intercepted messages before she could possibly offer any form of response. Patel didn't miss a beat. He told her exactly where to look. He informed her that the heavily redacted, but highly relevant, passages were printed and brightly highlighted on page 47 of the red folder, sitting right in front of her. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely turn the heavy pages. When she finally found page 47, she stared down at the highlighted text. The C-SPAN cameras captured the exact moment the last vestiges of hope died in her eyes. Her skin, already ashen, turned a sickening, translucent white. The silence stretched past the point of endurance. 10 agonizing seconds ticked by. Then 20. Then 30. The entire political world was holding its breath. Chairman Johnson finally leaned into his microphone, his voice breaking the suffocating tension. He asked her, with forced parliamentary politeness, If she required a brief recess to formally consult with her legal counsel, she did not acknowledge the chairman. She didn't speak. She just kept staring down at the highlighted text on page 47, completely paralyzed by the reality of her own words staring back at her. Finally, after another agonizing eternity, a sound escaped her throat. It was barely audible, a fractured, defeated whisper. She told the chairman that she needed to consult with her attorney. Patel nodded. His voice was incredibly soft now, possessing the terrifying, serene calm of a surgeon who has completely finished the operation. He acknowledged her absolute right to seek legal counsel. But, he added, dropping the final apocalyptic hammer onto the table, he needed her to state her intentions for the official congressional record. He asked her, directly and clearly, if she was formally invoking her Fifth Amendment constitutional right to protect herself against self-incrimination regarding the specific questions he had raised concerning her potential criminal violations of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. And there it was. The clock struck exactly 11:47 a.m. It was the frozen, terrifying second where the entire architecture of her life violently collapsed. Every single person sitting in that cavernous room, from the most seasoned political veteran to the youngest press intern, understood the apocalyptic weight of what was happening. Legally, the Fifth Amendment is a sacred constitutional shield. It is an absolute protection against state power that every citizen possesses. But politically, in the brutal, unforgiving arena of public opinion and congressional theater, taking the Fifth on live television while being interrogated by the director of the FBI was a catastrophic, inescapable admission of absolute guilt. She turned her head slowly, looking at her broken attorney one last time. The lawyer, his face drained of all color, gave her a microscopic, agonizingly reluctant nod. He was telling her to pull the cord. The political career was dead, and all that mattered now was staying out of federal prison. She turned back to the microphone. She dragged a massive, shaky breath into her lungs. Acting on the strict advice of her legal counsel, she announced, her voice trembling so violently it threatened to break apart entirely, that regarding the specific questions concerning the meetings with Qatari officials and the devastating allegations of FARA violations, she was formally answering yes, and she was officially invoking her Fifth Amendment rights. The hearing room instantaneously detonated. The suffocating silence was shattered by a wall of absolute, uncontrollable chaos. The press pit erupted as dozens of journalists physically vaulted over chairs, sprinting desperately for the heavy wooden doors to file the alert of the decade. On the Republican side of the dais, lawmakers were literally shouting over each other, their voices echoing in a chaotic chorus, screaming that she had taken the Fifth. On the Democratic side, sheer panic had taken hold, with members frantically waving their arms, desperately screaming for the chairman to declare an immediate emergency recess to stop the bleeding. The battery of press cameras went into overdrive. The blinding strobe effect of 100 flashes going off simultaneously, bathing the room in harsh white light. Deep within the server farms that powered the modern internet, the digital architecture of Twitter violently caught fire, overwhelmed by the sheer, unprecedented volume of real-time reactions. Above the roar of the room, Chairman Johnson was violently hammering his wooden gavel against the sounding block. The concussive strikes sounded like a frantic burst of gunfire echoing through the high ceilings. He was screaming for order at the top of his lungs, but his voice was entirely swallowed by the noise. There was no order to be found. The room had descended into a state of beautiful, terrible, inevitable political chaos. Through it all, Kash Patel remained completely, terrifyingly motionless. He sat quietly at the witness table, an island of absolute calm in the center of a raging hurricane. He slowly reached out and closed the cover of his red folder. He folded his hands neatly on top of it. He waited with infinite patience for the sheer volume of the room to burn itself out. His expression was not triumphant. He did not look like a man who had just destroyed a powerful political enemy. He looked incredibly sad. He possessed the weary, burdened demeanor of a veteran trauma surgeon who had just been forced to walk into a waiting room and deliver catastrophic, life-ending news to a devastated family. He had executed his duty flawlessly. He had done exactly what the law required him to do. But he extracted absolutely no joy from the carnage. When the screaming and the frantic movement finally subsided, just enough for a human voice to be heard over the din, he leaned forward and engaged his microphone one final time. He addressed her directly. He wanted to ensure the record was absolutely crystal clear. He stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority, that her decision to invoke her Fifth Amendment rights was a completely legal, entirely proper, and fundamentally constitutional protection that belonged to every American citizen. He emphasized that there should be absolutely no legal stigma attached to her decision to exercise that sacred right. He paused, letting the constitutional grace note settle. Then, he delivered the final, fatal administrative blow. He informed her, framing it as a professional courtesy, and that the highest levels of the Department of Justice had been actively monitoring the live feed of the hearing. He stated that, entirely based upon her sudden, highly public invocation of the Fifth Amendment in direct response to explosive questions regarding foreign espionage statutes, the Attorney General's office would inevitably demand an immediate, hyper-expedited, and totally exhaustive review of every single granular detail contained within Case File 2021DC4478. He allowed one final, incredibly long pause to stretch across the wreckage of the room. He announced that he possessed absolutely no further information to provide to the committee at that time. He leaned back in his leather chair, unclasped his hands, and waited. The hearing was over. The entire world knew it. Ilhan Omar knew it. The Chairman Johnson surveyed the absolute devastation of his committee room. He recognized that the proceedings had completely broken down. He made the only parliamentary decision available to him. He slammed the gavel down one final time, his voice ringing out over the chaos, declaring that the committee was officially in recess, pending an emergency consultation with the committee's legal counsel. He announced that they would reconvene at a time that was entirely yet to be determined. The wooden gavel struck the block with a heavy, hollow thud. And with that singular sound, the political existence of Ilhan Omar was permanently extinguished. The subsequent 60 minutes unfolded in a blinding, uncontrollable blur of sheer panic. She fled the hearing room the exact second the gavel fell. She did not walk. She sprinted, be completely surrounded by a frantic, moving phalanx of terrified lawyers and panicked staffers who formed a desperate human shield around her. She offered no statements. She threw no defiant glances at the press corps waiting hungrily in the marble hallways. It was nothing more than a blind, terrified dash to the subterranean safety of the congressional parking garage, where she practically dove into the back seat of a waiting black SUV with heavily tinted windows. But the physical escape was meaningless. The digital damage was absolute and irreversible. Within minutes of her fleeing the building, the isolated high-definition video clips of her destruction were dominating every screen on the planet. The networks played the horrific sequence on an endless, looping repeat. Now, the agonizing moment she actually muttered the words to plead the Fifth. The catastrophic, paralyzing shock that warped her face the exact second Patel casually introduced the existence of the intercepted Qatari WhatsApp messages. The brutal, inescapable mathematics of the $275,000 campaign payout. The surreal, bizarre reality of the simultaneous marriages. Every single, deeply complex, highly nuanced federal allegation was instantly ripped from the context of the hearing and brutally compressed into perfect, bite-sized, highly weaponized digital fragments designed for maximum viral consumption. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the digital reality of her collapse was undeniable. The hashtag demanding her immediate federal indictment was the #1 trending topic on the entire planet. But Kash Patel's name was trending at number 2. The phrase, "plead the fifth," occupied the 3rd slot. The cable news networks went into total meltdown. CNN completely abandoned its scheduled afternoon programming, throwing up massive, glaring red graphics, screaming, "Breaking news." The anchors, struggling to process the sheer magnitude of the unforced error, reported that in one of the most explosive oversight hearings in modern congressional history, the progressive icon had invoked her constitutional right against self-incrimination, while being brutally dismantled over potential foreign espionage violations. Over on Fox News, the framing was entirely devoid of nuance. Their massive lower third graphics blared the victory. How they announced that the Congresswoman had taken the 5th as the director of the FBI, ruthlessly exposed a sprawling, multi-front federal criminal investigation targeting her entire life. Even the deeply sympathetic confines of MSNBC, a network that had spent years aggressively defending her from conservative attacks, found it entirely impossible to spin the horrific visual optics of the disaster. Their legal analysts, looking visibly pained, attempted to thread the needle. They repeatedly stressed to their audience that the Fifth Amendment is a sacred right and fundamentally cannot be legally construed as an admission of guilt. But they inevitably concluded the sheer brutality of the hearing had raised catastrophic, deeply serious questions that would relentlessly haunt the Congresswoman for the rest of her natural life. Was the isolated video clips shattered viewing records, racking up tens of millions of views within the first hour of being posted. But the most devastating weapon of the afternoon was not a video. It was a single high-definition still frame. It was the exact image captured by the C-SPAN cameras at precisely 11:47 a.m. It was the frozen, horrifying portrait of her face, the absolute second the trap snapped shut. Her eyes were impossibly wide. Her skin was completely drained of color, and her mouth was slightly parted in a silent scream of realization. The image was instantly immortalized. It became the ultimate digital meme. The internet weaponized her terror, the most popular variation